Tish Chauhan, the CEO of BSE, for being so kindly agreeing to host this event. When I approached them, they immediately said, yes, of course, we're big fans of Parag. So Parag, your reputation precedes you. I must also thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for RSVPing. I think we got a record RSVP of 150, which is a record as far as I know. The highest record until today was for the lunch with Margaret Thatcher, which was 50 RSVPs. So we've exceeded it by 100, and I think, and Anil, you can take heart because you and I have often discussed how people don't RSVP, so things are changing. And I think the ladies, each one of you deserves a warm round of applause, so let's give that credit where it's due. I would also like to acknowledge the gratitude of ATG Chartwell for introducing us to Parag and thank Parag for accepting this invitation to stop by and address us this evening. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of a couple of consul generals here. I see the Canadian Consul General. Are there any other consul generals here? I think we have the representative from Canada. So let's give him a warm round of applause. And of course, as I mentioned, our two partners, besides the members of the collaborating chambers, that's Anil Dharkar and Asad Lalji of Avid Learning. Now for a few housekeeping announcements. On October 17th is our next event. As I mentioned to you, this is the second series. This is a tighter event, which will be essentially for CEOs and CFOs, and our audience will be limited to 50 people only on a first-come, first-served basis. It's on the new Indian Companies Act, and it's going to be presented, analyzed, dissected for us by a senior core team of KPMG. In fact, we have Gautam Chemburkar here somewhere of KPMG, senior partner. Gautam, where are you? Oh, there you are. And so you will get, starting tomorrow, email invitations for this event. It will be an evening event, but as I mentioned, we'll have to restrict it to 50 people max, so it'll be on a first-come, first-served in terms of RSVPs. Then in November 17th, we have our second speaker in this second series, and that speaker is another global Indian. Some of you may have heard of him, some of you know him, another Mumbaikar, Ashley Tellis. Ashley will be speaking as part of the Mumbai Literary Festival that Anil Dharkar organizes. So that event will be at the Tata Theatre on Sunday, 17th November at 12 noon, Anil? At 12 noon. And you will get an intimation separately for that. Then again, on November 18th and 19th, we have a joint summit between the Maharashtra government, the European Union, and Bombay First. It's at the Taj Land's End. Details of the summit are being circulated today, including how to register. And if you haven't got a copy of that flyer, please collect one from the registration desk. In December, we'll have our third speaker of this series, and that is Dr. Sam Pitroda. Sam has promised to let me know the exact date, and as soon as we know the date, we'll advise you of the time and the venue. And with that, over to you, Narinder, our chairman of Bombay First. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Narinder Nair.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Thank you very much. Good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to extend my own words of welcome to you all here this evening. Thank you for coming to this function. And I'd also like to thank Parag for so kindly accepting our invitation to, as Roger said, just drop in Mumbai on your worldwide tour. In fact, you are going to Singapore, but I was under the impression you were still in the West there. But anyway, thank you very much for coming here. You can see you're going to talk on a very important subject, which is very topical at the moment. And I'd also like to add my thanks to Mr. Ramdra, who will be here, and Mr. Chauhan for allowing us the use of this beautiful facilities here. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is becoming increasingly urbanized over the past century. You know, mankind has made a dash for the city. In 1900, only 13% of the people lived in urban areas, and today the number is nearly 51%. And according to some predictions and reports, this is likely to rise to more than 70% by 2050. The cities will be the nuclei of the new world order. And therefore, it's very important to have your views, Parag. This is the age of the cities, very appropriate title, and how can India adapt? But our thing is, many cities act as centers of innovation and are the main drivers of economic growth. The big question facing us is, our cities capable of meeting these challenges? In my view, looking at experience in India, they are not. Let me take the example of Mumbai. Mumbai city has had a glorious past and was often described as the jewel of the Raj. Gillian Tyndall described not long ago Bombay as the city of gold, where for 300 years people had been coming to make fortunes, and indeed fortunes were made. May I also welcome Ram? Thank you very much for coming, and thank you for hosting us here. As I said, that Gillian Tyndall called City of Gold. For 300 years, people have been coming to make fortunes, and the fortunes were indeed made. But something happened over the last 30 to 40 years, and Mumbai, instead of equipping itself to meet the challenges of urbanization, declined rapidly on both dimensions of economic growth and quality of life. We know, we people who live in Mumbai, we can see what's happening. Our infrastructure is totally inadequate. We are carrying the 21st century traffic on the 19th century infrastructure. Railways carry 6 million passengers every day. Bus services carry nearly 5 million people. But they are packed in sardines. The rail cars, which would normally carry 200 passengers, are sometimes carrying 500 to 600 passengers. Other problem of housing, difficult. 1,500 families come into the city every day. Where do they go? Slums. Bombay is one of the most densest cities in the world, where in some areas 37,000 people per square kilometer, and during peak time, nearly 100,000 people live in the city. So a lot of people have been talking about this, talking about the problem, the difficulty of the city, the difficulty about water, sanitation, etc. But the question was, not many people were coming forward to say what something should be done. So we thought, what can the citizens do? What can the corporates do? And that's where the Bombay First came in. Earlier this evening, I was asked by several people, what is Bombay First about? So that is where the genesis of Bombay First started. And it is over, about 15 years ago, Bombay First started as an initiative of the corporate world, modeled very much on London First. Our vision was very much to make our city a better place to live, work, and invest in. A few years ago, Bombay First, with the agreement and the blessings of the then Chief Minister, undertook a study together with McKinsey to see how Mumbai could be transformed into a world-class city. We benchmark our city against the global standards in areas of transport, housing, health, education, governance, and found that we were far below the acceptable world standards on all those areas. Fortunately, our study was well received by the state government, by the Prime Minister, and more importantly with the World Bank, who has been supporting us for the last few years. Where did that lead to? That led to establishment of a very effective public-private partnership with the state government. And according to the World Bank, this is the only public-private partnership of a regeneration of a city that works successfully anywhere in the world. A lot of things have happened, but I'd like to mention two very important institutions that have been established by the state government to work with the citizens with Bombay First. One is the Citizens Action Group, where the 30 members drawn from cross-section of society meet once in 6 months or 9 months under the chairmanship of the Chief Minister to see what is happening and what should be done. And more importantly, there is the Empowered Committee of the Chief Secretary, headed by the Chief Secretary, which meets every month. And it's not like any other Empowered Committee. This is an Empowered Committee set up by the government of Maharashtra, where apart from the bureaucrats and all the stakeholders, all the major players like the Municipal Commissioner, MMRD Commissioner, the Police Commissioner, and all others, members, but there are 8 members from the private sector who are members of this Government Empowered Committee. And I'm told this is the first time in the history of bureaucracy that you have a Government Empowered Committee with members of the private sector sitting on it. While a lot has been done, there is still that needs to be done. We're working with a set of 7, 8 verticals looking at housing, transport, education, health, security issues, and also dealing with a governance issue. But while we've been talking about infrastructure initially, but let me also say take a moment to say on the security. Following the tragic events of 26/11, Bombay First thought we should do something to see how we can bring the international experience to help the city of Bombay to have a better security. So with the support of our friends in London First, we brought in 7, 8 experts who were involved with the aftermath of 7/7 and 9/11. People who are involved on the committees there, people who worked in the United States, in New York, with Giuliani at that time, and people who worked in 7/7 committees in London, Deputy Mayor of London and others, including the working commissioner of the London Metropolitan Police, who came and had a very good interaction with us, advised the state government on what could be done, and they were very receptive. And a lot of things have been taken. In fact, there have been exchange of delegations backwards and forwards. And one of the things that suggested was CCTV system, which are still being talked about. And there are several other things that have been taken, but Roger told me to take only 5 minutes, but I'll just sum up, Roger. I'd like to mention one particular event, initiative which Bombay First has taken with the state government, which is very unique. That is to develop a 40-year concept plan where we need to be in 40 years' time. So we equip ourselves to meet the challenges of what's going to happen in 2050. And that is, Parag, you would be interested to know, that is being done by a consultant from Singapore. And this idea came off a vision document, 40-year plan, from discussion with Lee Kuan Yew, who was here, and said, look, come to Singapore and we'll tell you what we have done. And this is how this idea was developed, and Singapore is helping us. It's been a wonderful document, and we're now working on it. All I'll say also is that when we commenced our journey, we had no illusion the task was going to be easy, but we know what now the challenges and opportunities are. There are many problems, but one of the biggest problems that I think we are facing in Mumbai and other cities, Parag, we'd like your views on that too, is the issue of governance. Mumbai is currently run by multiple agencies. There are 17 agencies, in fact, which run the city. Some are responsible to the state, some are responsible to the center, some are responsible to the other agencies. And there is no single body and person responsible or accountable for Mumbai. Now, we have all these agencies are managed, run by very efficient people, so we have an excellent orchestra, but as I say, we have no director or a conductor. So in my view, if Mumbai has to change, we have to change the way it is governed. Because we must do that, because Mumbai is extremely important. As very often our Prime Minister says, Mumbai symbolizes India to the external world. So we have to see something should be done by the city. And all talk about the cities and the nations, I'm always reminded about John Kennedy said, that we neglect our cities at our peril, for in neglecting them, we neglect the nation. That's very true. That's what we tell our friends in politics and bureaucrats, and that this needs to be done. Well, I just given you a brief outline of what Bombay Fest is all about, what we are doing about the city, and I think it's a very important subject we're talking today, very important topic we're talking today. And one other thing I think Roger's already touched upon is this, the November conference. And this, I think, again, is a unique thing. We're bringing in international experience. We worked with Singapore to bring in their experience. Now we're looking at the West. The European Union, the entire European Union, is working with us to see how the best practices that are in developing cities in Europe can be brought to Bombay, can have a dialogue with the authorities here, and can develop, we can have a working arrangement. Some details are there. Please pick up one, and we'll love to have you at the 18-19 on the conference. Meanwhile, once again, thank you. Thank you, Parag, for being with us, and I look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Narinder. I'd like to make a disclaimer. The Singapore firm won the global tender not because Lee Kuan Yew recommended that we have a concept plan, a 40-year concept plan. It was a global tender and entirely on merit. I'd now like to request Mr. S. Ramadorai, the chairman of Bombay Stock Exchange, BSE as it's known today, to kindly introduce to us the BSE, and not that it needs an introduction after 100 years, but to tell us what it's up to. Thank you, Ram. Let's welcome Mr. Ramadorai.
Thank you, Roger. Mr. Narinder Nair, Chairman Bombay First, Mr. Ashish Chavan, CEO and Managing Director of the Bombay Stock Exchange, Dr. Parag Khanna, whom we are all very eager to listen to today on the age of cities, how can India adapt? A very, very warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to all of you. I think most of you know about this great institution, namely the Bombay Stock Exchange, as it is called now, BSE Limited. And this is the hall which used to be the trading floor when we had the whole outcry method of trading. The institution itself was set up in 1875, and it was called the Native Share and Stockbrokers Association, BSE Limited, formerly the Bombay Stock Exchange. And it's commonly known or popularly known as the Share Bazaar. And this has been the Asia's first stock exchange and boasts of several highs that dot its 138-year-old history. I think today we see a tall iconic building at Taral Street, housing one of India's best-known landmarks, BSE, and the story of BSE is the story of Indian economy, more or less. This institution has grown to be the 8th largest exchange in the world by the number of trades and the 10th largest by market capitalization. It's also the 5th largest index option market. Now we function in conjunction with the investor community of the country. We have been the first national exchange to launch their website in 3 regional languages, Hindi, Marathi and Gujarati, to reach out essentially to a wider audience. And we recently launched what we call as the BSE IPO Index and the PSU website. And it's the leader in exchange transacted mutual fund products. And following the success of the BSE Star Mutual Fund platform, in collaboration with Morningstar India, launched a dedicated website to empower investors with relevant information and tools on evaluating mutual fund investment opportunities. I think we also have a SME exchange, and again, this is one of the hallmarks where 25 companies have already listed and have generated positive returns for the investors, and quite a few other small and medium enterprises have shown a lot of interest. I think some of the overall size, expanding the overall size of the derivative market in the country is also been credited to BSE, and we launched what we call as the LEAPS, or the Liquidity Enhancement and Incentive Program, in September 2011, which is completely compliant with the SEBI regulations and essentially to create sustainable liquidity in the Sensex derivatives. Lot is emphasized over investor awareness and training, and we have been actively involved in initiatives towards educating the investors through its regular investor awareness programs and training on various aspects related to the Indian capital markets, which is very, very necessary. So we have created almost close to 1,600 investor awareness programs, conducted pan-India in 2012-13, and we plan to conduct about 2,000 programs, investor awareness programs, this financial year from April through March of 2014. I think we almost reached out to 2 lakh investors through our investor awareness programs. And these are essentially on do's and don'ts for the investors, instruments of investment, portfolio approach, mutual funds, trading, clearing and settlement, rolling settlement, investor protection and so on. I think we also have a subsidiary called the BSE Institute Limited, which we established in 1998, which imparts capital market training and certification to financial aspirants across the country. And this is again a first of its kind professional training institute and provides very specific training in securities modules. I think the last but not the least is the technology that powers this whole exchange. And we have kept pace with the latest technology and timely upgradation. And we have associated with Deutsche Börse, which will help BSE to put in place a technology that gives us an edge in terms of order handling capacity, speed as well as throughput. I think the kind of volumes we are looking at are handling capacity of 5 times, from around 20,000 orders a second to 100,000 orders per second. And the response time will be increasing by about 100 times in the next 3 to 4 months from the current 10 milliseconds. I think we also have a strategic partnership with the S&P Dow Jones Indices, allowing us to leverage the global marketing strength of a global leader in indices. I think we have won several awards and recognitions that acknowledge the work done by us and the progress made, like the Golden Peacock Global CSR Award for its initiatives in the corporate social responsibility, NASSCOM CNBC TV 18's IT User Awards in 2010 in the financial services category, Scotch Virtual Corporation 2000 Award in BSE Star Mutual Fund category, the Responsibility Award CSR by the World Council of Corporate Governance. I think as a leading Indian stock exchange, we are an iconic institution and symbolic of India's economic prowess and resilience as it continues to be a port of call for several high-level dignitaries from a multitude of fields. I think and the new tagline, as you can see, is what we call as experiencing the new, and hopefully we are poised to step into new frontiers in the financial markets in terms of technology, products and distribution. I think we are looking forward to hearing Dr. Parag Khanna today. So we very warmly welcome you to this institution and to this hall. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much, Ram, and also thank you once again for hosting this event. I now request Ashish Chauhan, the CEO and MD of BSE, to kindly introduce Dr. Parag Khanna. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Ashish Chauhan.
Shri S. Ramadurai, Chairman BSE, Mr. Nair, Chairman Mumbai First, Mr. Roger Pereira, friends, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to everyone present here. I am happy to welcome renowned futurist and geostrategist Dr. Parag Khanna, who is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation and also an associate professor at Singapore Institute of International Affairs. He is also an avid traveler on a mission to share his knowledge on evolving global and technological trends. Dr. Parag Khanna has advised governments from the US to Singapore and dozens of major multinational corporations. Named as Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum in 2009, Dr. Khanna has amassed a prodigious knowledge of world affairs by traveling to over 100 countries and speaking Hindi, German, French, Spanish, and Arabic. I have been an avid reader of his writings. He brings phenomenal clarity to the subject he deals with in a simple way. Although he is younger to me, I have no hesitation in saying that I am a flag-bearing and flag-waving fan of yours, sir. Dr. Khanna today will enlighten us on the growth of new world cities with the contrasting Indian cities. The talk will aim at predicting and influencing Mumbai's growth over the next few decades and will give us insights into the latest international trends about the evolution of Mumbai as a metropolis. We are all looking forward to listen to Dr. Khanna on this important discussion on the age of cities, how can India adapt, this evening. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Shall we go on to the audience so that we can watch? And ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Parag Khanna.
Good evening, everyone. Is it working? Good. Thank you so much, Ashish. Thank you, Mr. Ramadurai. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Narinder, for this warm welcome and for hosting me here in this really esteemed institution. Thank you, Narinder, for your remarks, which were already very insightful in setting the stage. With an intimate group like this, there's no reason for me to stand behind the podium or to lecture from notes. We can be much more conversational about all of this. I have a bunch of slides which I'll go through as quickly as I can because I really do want to get to the conversational part, not even as a Q&A. We should really have a discussion about how important these issues are. In fact, when Roger and I were emailing a while back about what topic to speak about this evening, we could have chosen some very significant themes. We could have talked about how and where and when World War III is going to break out, which major powers are going to be involved, how are US-China relations going to come completely off the rails. That would have drawn a crowd that would have been interesting. We could have talked about emerging markets and financial crises and destabilization of currencies. No doubt that would have been interesting too. But we settled on this, and I will submit to you and hopefully demonstrate to you that there is absolutely no more important topic that you could be talking about than urbanization. There are only two things you can take for granted about the future. You can't be certain about predictions about which emerging markets will succeed and which ones will fail. You cannot be certain about who will win the next world war. You can absolutely be certain that the world is urbanizing. You can be absolutely certain that technology is becoming ubiquitous. Those are the only two things that I think that we can be certain about in the world. Let me give you an example of what we've been wrong about. I'll just take one of thousands that one could pick. One is population. Do you remember the books about overpopulation, the coming population bomb, a world of 15 billion people? Well, all the recent estimates that have come out, 6 or 7 different institutions that track global demography, have more or less settled on a global population leveling off around 9 billion people. Right, so those predictions were wrong. Now, if each of you went home to your bookshelves, I bet you would also have a book or 2 or 5 about peak oil. It would have peak oil in the title of the book. When was the last time you heard the words peak oil? It's probably been a while, because it's not going to happen, because technology, new discoveries, and so forth have intervened in that picture. So we can make very big predictions about very big issues, and we can also be spectacularly wrong. There are 2 things that I'm quite certain we are not going to be wrong about when we talk about them. One is urbanization. The other is ubiquitous technology. So I thought we would bring them together tonight. And of course, this is the right city to be talking about it. This is, of course, India's premier, largest, greatest, most dynamic, most economically significant city. The fate of many countries hinges on their principal city. India is fortunate to have more than one principal city. Most countries are lucky to have one functioning, capital city, financial center, all unified really into one. And the fate of that country, of most countries in the world, hinges on the performance of whatever their one main capital city is. Can you name me a successful country in the world that does not have a stable capital or business hub? Well, mull over that for the rest of the evening and see if you can come up with something. I'll give you a hint. The answer is not Afghanistan or Somalia, right? So the fate of most nations hinges on the main city. The world is urbanizing very quickly. That is not all good news. And I'm actually going to begin with the bad news rather than the good news. Very often we take for granted that this organic urbanization that is happening is a good thing, an unmitigated good. It is a source of growth, of course, right? Economic opportunity comes from people migrating into cities. They're able to receive certain services, even if they have to seize them for themselves, that they would not receive elsewhere. So we have tended to take for granted that all urbanization is naturally a good thing, even though it leads to certain stress and crowding and so forth. But I'll probably present to you more of the downside of this urbanization that's going on than anyone has, because it's just as important to appreciate it. Let me jump right in. I forgot to ask if they're going to start my slides. Hold on. Excuse me. Could you activate the slides, please? Thank you. So Narendra presented some very important data about just the global scene as well as the Indian, and I'll show you to what extent, how rapid this urbanization since, as you said, since the beginning of the 20th century, how rapidly it has advanced from a urban world population of something on the order of 32% up to 50% today, and some predict up to 75% by the year 2025. And this is, of course, particularly happening in the heavily populated emerging markets, developing countries, post-colonial countries like India. I think they forgot about my... There we go. Okay, that was easy. So 53% urban today, 70% urban by 2030. As of a couple of years ago, majority of the world's population now lives in cities. And again, this is generally considered to be a sort of a secular trend. China is going to be adding 400 million people to cities in the next decade and a half. In India, it's projected to be about 200 plus million people. On a worldwide basis, what you see here, this is an infographic from UNICEF. You can see that actually, well, it's hard to read, but Brazil is actually one of the most urbanized, perhaps the most urbanized country in the world. 87% of the Brazilian population lives in cities for obvious reasons given the country's landscape. But as I mentioned, it's happening the fastest in the emerging markets in the developing world. What's interesting, I want to make some macro comments that again, I think that aren't normally part of the discussion around cities. We do have a limited amount of space in this world, right? And cities are growing so quickly that they're actually fusing into these mega clusters and corridors. Come to think of it, just late last night, I was driving from Pune to here on I'll call it the so-called expressway, since you probably know what I mean when I say that. It was advertised as a 2-hour trip. It took a little bit longer than that. If you've been on it, you know what I mean. But you are seeing these urban clusters forming, and some of them are so significant. They matter a lot more than countries, not just a little bit more, a lot more. Let me give you a couple of examples. The Hong Kong, Guangzhou, Pearl River Delta, right? That's actually 7 major Chinese cities, which together, and it's not just 7 cities in the same country, because as you know, with China, territories like Macau and Hong Kong have different administrative status. You have to present various papers and visas and whatnot to get across them. But that population cluster, the municipal authorities, the mayors and so forth, have been working to unite the infrastructure, to ease mobility, so that you can really start to think of the Pearl River Delta as one economic zone. If it were an independent country, it would be a member of the G20. Right, in terms of its economic size. So just that one little cluster in China, in southern China, is a larger economic zone than just about all but a dozen plus countries in the world today. And that's just one of the clusters in China that one can visit. Beijing Tianjin is another. If you haven't been there, Tianjin is one of the places where there's a new city being built, Tianjin Eco-City. There's high-speed rail connections. People now refer to that Beijing area as the Bohai Rim. It encompasses also 6 cities that are very infrastructurally connected. The point of this is that when you look at maps in the future, it isn't really quite clear where one city ends and one city begins. That's what happens when urbanization, the proximity of cities, the growing population, all come together and you start to create these mega city corridors. In the United States, Silicon Valley has become one. If you can read it, I put what I did up there was a play on words for the Middle East. You've all been to either Abu Dhabi or Dubai, but now, and I know I spent my childhood there, and I remember the distance between Abu Dhabi and Dubai felt like a long 100-kilometer drive. Today it's becoming a long sort of urbanized zone, and so I call it Abu Dubai. because 15, 20 years from now, that's more and more like what it will feel like. In India, of course, there is an initiative, the DMIC, to unite or to connect, I should say, Mumbai and Delhi. We all know that this project has not initially lived up to expectations in terms of the timeline. It may not even as ambitious as it is, and I've been following the plans and looking at it for years now. The plan to build 7 new special economic zones or manufacturing centers along this area is a very good model. It maps to the best of what we think should be done when it comes to strategic urbanization. But the political execution, the political momentum, and the volume of investment is not yet sufficient. Now I'm going to come back to some of these new cities in a little while. But over the course of the evening, bear in mind that some of the recommendations I make are really about scale, right? For the scale of a country of India's size, everything that is being done well has to be done at an order of magnitude more, better, larger, bigger than it is, which is a very polite way of saying one has to think a bit more like China when it comes to how one tackles some of these issues. Now, like I said, I'm not going to portray urbanization as an unmitigated good. Let me show you some of the bad news. This is one that you can all sympathize with. More urbanization means more traffic. And when IBM set out to do a measurement of the impact of traffic jams and commuter delays on GDP, they came up with this commuter pain index. I suppose they didn't include Mumbai in the survey at all, but Delhi has a strong showing up there in the sort of red zone on the upper left. Suffice it to say that this has a lot to do, of course, with the quality and the volume of just the traditional infrastructure in the city. Were it not for the flyover, I'm sure you can all remember what it was like coming from the airport down here 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and sort of 2 years ago to today. You need what the famous architect Jaime Lerner, who became the mayor of Curitiba in Brazil, one of the fascinating sort of pilot cities for sustainable urban infrastructure investment, like bus rapid transit and so forth. He calls it urban acupuncture. You need these release valves of infrastructure through the city to ease the flow of people and mobility and let people get on with their lives. And some of the projects in Mumbai, like the flyover, have obviously done that. But commuter pain is certainly one of the downsides of urbanization. Another is one, again, we don't think about enough, but of course it's greenhouse gas emissions, right? Cities represent a very small part of the Earth's surface area, but they represent most of its energy use, most of its greenhouse gas emissions. How can we simultaneously celebrate people moving into cities for economic opportunity and have climate change as one of our #1 priorities? How are we going to square that circle? It's a huge challenge. There's only limited contexts where you can really see cities proactively taking steps to reduce their emissions. There is a C40 initiative amongst the world's mayors that is attempting to spread best practices, construction techniques, and other kinds of clean technology, but not nearly enough. There's the phenomenon of eco-refugees. In China, the combination of urbanization, particularly in the northern cities, and the river diversion of China's major river systems, pushing water from south to north, has created a situation where some people estimate anywhere from 2,000 to 20,000 smaller rivers have dried up in China. And it's created millions of what the UN is calling environmental refugees. Worldwide, because of drought, desertification, and so forth, there are, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, more environmental refugees in the world today than political refugees. Now, when the UN was created and when the High Commissioner of Refugees was created, it was mainly for political conflicts. They now deal, in fact, more with northern Kenya, Rift Valley-style ecological refugees than they do with Syrian refugees. Such is the state. Now, I don't blame that on urbanization, of course, entirely, but urbanization is part of the reason that China is conducting the river diversion that is leading to this drying up of rivers. Then there is subsidence. I'm not sure who's familiar with that word. Subsidence is the phenomenon of groundwater depletion from the draining of aquifers that leads to pockets, subterranean pockets that compress due to the weight of our infrastructure and so forth. These sinkholes, if you Google this, on depending on what kind of mood you're in, you'll find some pretty staggering photographs of sinkholes that are just popping up, in the middle of cities around the world, sucking in homes and buildings and people. Live human beings are being sucked into the ground. You don't have to watch a Hollywood movie for this. It's happening everywhere from Florida to Guatemala to China. There are sinkholes that pop up in Beijing and Shanghai. One wonders, if and when it would be, skyscrapers are actually dug very deep. But could you imagine what would happen if somewhere near a major skyscraper, some kind of sinkhole emerged that were to weaken the foundations of some 150-story building, and that were to fall? I mean, we would consider that sort of eco-terrorism or something like that. So this is another negative consequence, the increasing rate of subsidence in major cities. Then there's coastal sinking, and this is a map of the U.S. If you look on this particular website, which I can share with anyone, you can slide the scale and look at the growing number of American coastal cities that will be threatened by rising sea levels over the course of the next 100 years. If you apply this worldwide, the OECD and the World Bank have done a study of 136 coastal cities, many of them in Asia, and looking at which cities in the world are susceptible to any one of three different kinds of natural disasters, whether it's earthquakes, typhoons, tsunamis, rising sea levels, and so forth. And it turns out that many major Asian cities, flooding as well, whether it's Bangkok, Jakarta, Manila, and so on, are the most susceptible to three or more kinds of major natural disasters. So the world is rapidly urbanizing. Asia has more people than any in the world. Asians are moving into cities. Asian cities are the most susceptible to massive natural catastrophes. Are we not setting ourselves up for a devastating perfect storm of sort of self-inflicted ecological genocide in a way? There's very negative scenarios that one could imagine as we put all our eggs, if you will, we're putting all our demographic eggs into the urban basket, and we're doing it in cities that are the most prone to natural disasters, which are increasing in frequency because of climate change. So this is what we call a complex system, right? Where we urbanize on one level, we think of it as different from the climate issue and different from other issues, but in fact these all interrelate and affect each other in ways that may not all be good. Then there's income inequality. Now the global inequality is actually decreasing across countries, which is to say poorer countries on average are becoming wealthier. Globalization has helped to raise some of the poorest of the poor, but inequality within countries is growing. You can see this within countries like China. You have first world cities, second world cities, and sort of third world cities, right? Guiyu on the right is interesting. It's a place where China imports scrap IT material, and this is the place to which they send it to be picked apart further for metals and plastics and other kinds of parts. But there's no public infrastructure. The sort of chemicals leak into the water supply and so forth. Then there's inequality within cities. We know this from Mumbai, and I'll come back to it. But around the world, you're seeing this discrepancy. So let me ask you something. Who remembers when, about 10, 15 years ago, there were huge protests at the World Trade Organization summits, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the multilateral agreement on investments? Do you remember the Battle of Seattle in 1999 when protesters from around the world stormed Seattle to protest the WTO, and the SWAT teams of Americans with their machine guns and water cannons were menacingly pushing away the protesters, right? What happened to all of that? Don't we still have global inequality? Aren't there still cries for global justice? Because that's what that was about, right? That was about the plight of the third world. That was about Starbucks sipping, French protesters claiming to speak on behalf of the world's poor, and also some poor people as well, labor unions and so forth. They were all there. What happened to all those protests? Can someone answer that? Why did they all go away? Why don't we have those protesters anymore? The reason is, I just gave you. It's because inequality within countries is now much worse than inequality across them, right? And so instead of those protests at the WTO and the World Bank, you have Occupy Wall Street. You have Occupy Mumbai. Did you have Occupy Mumbai here? No? you should have, occupy hundreds of cities around the world. You had Occupy protests because people have realized that the inequality within their own country is their primary concern, their primary consideration. And India is, of course, one of the most unequal countries in the world that is visible within the cities, it's visible across them. But suffice it to say that the notion that the poor people of the world are going to, or rather that the protest movements of the world are going to be targeting the domestic audiences now more, the domestic leadership, more than these international gatherings. And there's a very clear economic and statistical underpinning for this. Because precisely at the time in the last 5 years that the world population that is urban has crossed 50%, is exactly the same time at which, and these are all correlated, at which this domestic inequality became greater than international inequality, which is precisely why the protests are now domestic rather than international. So all of these phenomena are interconnected. You cannot simply wave a wand to get out of problems like this. Let me give you the example of a country like Nigeria, which many people celebrate as a thriving emerging market. Has anyone been in Nigeria? Few of you. Okay, so you can sympathize with, the picture on the left is something called Echo Atlantis. It's just a fancy graphic rendering because it doesn't exist. But Bill Clinton went over there to cut a ribbon last year as they break ground on this project. It's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, very fancy real estate developers are involved, and it's going to house, elites going shopping at Cartier, right? And it's going to be built on this peninsula called the Lekki Peninsula, which is sort of the posh neighborhood of Lagos. A few miles away is a place called Makoko, and this is a picture of a little boy sitting in the next canoe. I went paddling through Makoko. There's a video of this on CNN, you can see through my website. I went paddling through Makoko for a couple of hours. It's the worst slum in the world, at least that I've been to, and I've been to quite a few. It honestly makes Dharavi look like Paris. It is really, really that bad. It is an open latrine into which all the sewage of the city is dumped. People build these rickety wooden sort of homes that are still, and then the police have come in, the military has come in to do the sort of slum clearance and literally just taken machetes and axes and been chopping down people's homes. But they have no place to go, so they just rebuild them on the same spot. So within cities, this is what you're finding. You've got elites who are building their Echo Atlantis, and then you've got the tens of thousands of people who live in Makoko. And this is replicating itself everywhere. Some of you may have, again, on the expressway towards Pune, you can make a turnoff and visit the Lavasa project. It's obviously a very, very, very small venture, but that's part of the problem, you see. When we think that there is a new construction solution on a small scale, it applies to maybe a few, 1,000 people. Lavasa seems like more of a resort type of getaway than something that's going to be a, really functioning, thriving metropolis. And of course, since this is one of the largest cities in the world, we can make this comparison of scale. How many people will benefit from a Lavasa-like project versus how many people live in Dharavi, which is, of course, over 1 million people in a very small space. So I'm going to talk about technology quite a bit. But you have to bear in mind that technology is only part of the solution to the scale problem. So I hope I've made the case thus far that sustainable urbanization ought to be a sort of governing paradigm. Again, we could be talking about any number of major themes tonight. Everyone has their pet priority. People have come into this room and lectured you about the importance of healthcare, the importance of education, the importance of the environment, right? But there's only one phenomenon that sort of really does unify us around the world. This sort of phenomenon where we're all in this together, it has a global impact, and just about every other priority or policy issue that people want to promote does somehow fit into this issue of cities, of making urban life sustainable, since most of the world does in fact live in cities and will continue to. So let me look at technology. I've said that this is the other sort of essential, fundamental trend in the world, and I think you probably all intuitively feel this. You're all part of this by carrying smartphones in your pocket and sort of living in a way in technology. So I won't go into as much detail as I would with a non-urban, sort of a connected, wired audience, such as I'm sure all of you are. But there is this phenomenon of the smart city. How can we take our existing cities and use technology to achieve that kind of urban acupuncture I was talking about earlier? And how can we, through certain demonstration projects, maybe like Lavasa or others that I will show you, experiment with technologies that we can then scale on a much, much larger basis? So some of the technologies involved in this that are being experimented with around the world are sensors, so this sort of Internet of Things phenomenon, devices that sort of connected street lights, air quality meters and so forth, that not only take readings, but also share that data with urban authorities, also share them with citizens so that they know what the conditions are in their area and so forth. Generally, this is around sort of a mix of hardware and software types of interventions that are being used. Let me give you some examples of this. This is how governments are using this. Actually, I think that Narendra's point about the ways in which the 15, 17, I think you said, agencies are cooperating now in Mumbai. What's happening is that these dashboards that are being developed help the many layers of authority in a city, because cities are a place where the federal authority, the municipal authority, local authorities, even provincial authorities all wind up overlapping with each other. Then there's the functional authorities within cities, those responsible for security, those responsible for health, those responsible for infrastructure, and so forth. All of these need to be coordinated. Information has to be shared. We have seen so many instances where disaster has struck even though the information was present because it simply was not shared correctly. So there is an effort to take all of the sensor data that is being collected in cities increasingly, to share it with authorities and allow them to share it with each other to be able to make these key issues, again, public service delivery, resource management, transportation, waste, and so forth, as efficient as possible. That has to be done everywhere. Rather than focus, I'll give you a mix of new cities that aren't even on the map yet, that you've never even heard of, but 5 years from now when you buy a map, they'll be there. And then the problem that afflicts most of the world, including Mumbai, which is to retrofit. How do you take an existing city, like in New York, and make it less congested, make it more efficient? And Mayor Bloomberg has been very, very active and aggressive in this regard. He's brought in IBM to do a lot of data crunching. They've done a lot of work with traffic signals. They've done a lot of work with creating more pedestrian areas, closing traffic to cars on certain days. All of these things have actually contributed to making New York more livable. They've just announced that the 13,000 decrepit yellow taxis that you're all familiar with, it's a Ford model Crown Victoria, they'll all be gone in about a year and a half. So see them while you can, or see them in the old movies. They'll be gone. They're going to be replaced by Nissan Leafs, or a Nissan Leaf engine, but a sort of van-like design, electric car. That's the kind of ambition in a big city with tens of thousands of taxis to say, all at once, we're going to scrap the old gas guzzlers and bring in the new. So it can be done with the right amount of money, with public-private partnerships, with political leadership. I'll give you, this is Bloomberg's command center, where a lot of this coordination gets done. I've kind of tried to map out for you just quite a few of the new city projects, things, again, that are not even on the map yet, but will be, or districts of new cities. So in Toronto, they're building a whole new area called the Waterfront, sort of from scratch. You might be familiar with this one. And some of these actually, King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi Arabia, I'm going there next month. I haven't been there yet myself. And then some of these major retrofit projects. I just showed you New York. I'll talk as well about what's happening in Rio. Rio is, again, Brazil is not a rich country on a per capita basis, but after the massive mudslides that they had a couple of years ago, it was a real wake-up call for the government. There was significant political unrest as a result of the government not having taken action to protect citizens. So they've installed a lot more sensors in some vulnerable areas, and they now have a command center that looks sort of like New York's, and they now are able to, measure rainfall in advance, track patterns better, warn through SMS services and other kinds of means, warn citizens when there's a potential mudslide in their area. They've also done more to improve social mobility and equity. Rather, Brazilians are very afraid of their own slums. It's a country where they really do fear each other for ethnic and socioeconomic reasons. But despite that, in Rio, they've started to build these kinds of cable cars that, or sort of trolley systems that are connecting some of the favelas to the main kind of city downtown areas, because they don't want there to be a two-tier sort of city or enclaves where poor people are trapped and not allowed out. And thus far, it's proven to be a successful way of promoting social mobility, and it hasn't raised crime further than I suppose it already was, since Rio is sadly a violent city. A couple of examples of new cities. Songdo in South Korea. Who's heard of Songdo? Okay. Into Songdo. Okay, it's interesting. It's probably the most advanced sort of smart city project built completely from scratch that there is in the world right now. It's located near Incheon Airport. What they're doing at Songdo, with a planned residency of about 100,000 people. So again, not big, right? And Korea is in any case a very advanced country. But they're starting from scratch and creating a city that will have, mostly LEED certified buildings, Cisco telepresence systems, health monitors in home units that, sort of check your vital statistics and send it directly electronically to clinics, to read your biometric data and so forth. Sort of self-regulating heating and cooling of units that know whether there's someone home or not. All of these kinds of things are being experimented with in Songdo. Some of these will eventually make their way into China, right, which is experiencing this most rapid urbanization in the world. The Chinese are studying the Songdo model very closely and looking at how they can import some of these technologies into their own projects. One of them is the Changsha Sky City. Has anyone heard of this? Changsha in south-central China. This Sky City will soon be the tallest building in the world, taller than the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. And I do mean soon, because they're going to finish this building, which they're just starting, probably by the end of 2014. So not only is it the tallest building in the world, the Chinese want to build it very fast. What's interesting about Changsha Sky City is not just the infrastructure. We can always wow each other with how tall one can build a building. What's interesting is the residential model. They want Sky City to actually be a city in a building. Everything you need in life will be in that building. So the schools, the hospitals, the sports facilities, the recreation, everything, the movie theaters, the restaurants, everything will literally be in one building. This one building will house something like 30,000+ people. It's an experiment, doesn't necessarily sound like the place you want to live, but this is China. Their problems are on an order of magnitude greater than any other place in the world, except India. India's problems are on the same scale as China. Watch this space. I'm not advocating any of these things. I'm telling you what the world is trying to do to cope with rapid urbanization. India needs to study every single one of these examples for its strengths, for its weaknesses. I don't know how this is going to turn out, but the Chinese are trying it. They're trying a lot of other things too. Another great example, perhaps the leading example of moving towards a zero emissions transportation system, is in Berlin. Again, not a new city by any stretch. They will have more shared electric cars, so cars owned by the state or owned by a consortium of public and private players. They've gotten rival firms like Daimler and BMW to cooperate in developing this. Battery technologies, the public transportation, the subway system, everyone is involved. There are 30, 40 agencies involved in developing this. They want to have about 50,000 electric cars available for all residents in just about 10, 15 years' time. And again, this is indicative of a cultural shift as well. Germans have the best cars in the world. It's quite an effort to get them to say, well, I'm not going to buy a BMW or Mercedes. I'll just drive around in one of these. Right? It's a reminder that this is ultimately about people and our choices, not just about technology. Germany is a place that has been conditioning its population to think about and to prioritize sustainability for about 25 years. years. You can go back and look, you can find these online, posters from the city of Freiburg in southwestern Germany on the Swiss and French border. They had posters going back 25 years encouraging people not to buy cars, to take buses and so forth. And Germany is, in fact, alongside Japan, in terms of large populous countries, by far the most sustainable when it comes to, sort of per capita consumption of wide basket of resources. Hong Kong is another example where there are some new interesting construction projects going on. You may have heard of BIM, Building Information Modeling, developed by Frank Gehry's company. What they're doing is developing or designing buildings that reflect certain amount of heat and light, but absorb another component of it to provide the energy that then powers the cooling systems and so forth. So there's a lot of experiments going on all over the world. There's hundreds and hundreds of interesting things going on that one could talk about. I mentioned the problem of scale. For every small city that is a sort of pilot project, there's a reminder that you have to think about how to scale this up to the size of megacities and super corridors that we have today. You cannot forget about the people living in the slums of the world. You have to think about also how to pay for it. And this is, I want to spend a couple of minutes on this, because a lot more public and private capital should be going into thinking about the various dimensions of bringing about sustainable urbanization than is currently the case. Because I think of this as a potential win-win, and I don't use that phrase sort of glibly. Private capital investors that are looking for longer-term investments and returns should really be thinking about the essential infrastructure investments, not both the hard infrastructure, the traditional things, the roads, the railways, and so forth that are lacking across India, but also the sustainable technologies that will make societies more productive, and that will ultimately make the kinds of consumers that other companies want to see as well. I'll give you an example of how this has risen up the agenda. The G20. This photo was taken about a month ago at the G20 summit in Russia. The G20 you've come to view as an organization that basically talks about the need for more fiscal stimulus for economies in the wake of the financial crisis, preventing protectionism, trade protectionism, and a variety of other global macroeconomic kinds of issues. But just last month, they decided to really make infrastructure investment and urbanization a major priority. And they devoted some space in their statement to this. And the business leaders who accompanied the G20 at their meetings issued a full report, which is actually worth reading, about how to finance job-creating sustainable urbanization. They looked at risk mitigation guarantees by some of the major public banks. They put together a $20 billion fund to help developing country cities draft the kind of projects that have the right business plans that private investors would be interested in, and to create a separate fund that's going to jumpstart sustainable technology investments. All of those are finally at the top of the global agenda, which I think helps to make my point for this paradigm of sustainable urbanization. This is also about job creation. Now in India, finally, there is a realization that the IT industry is certainly a driver of economic growth, but it's not a driver of job creation. And in a very large country with a very young population, one has to think about that. At the same time, emerging markets that are trying to get more into manufacturing are squeezed to some extent because of not only is there competition for the outsourced labor, but now there's competition through automation, right? Robotics that is also displacing jobs. Foxconn workers in China are losing their jobs already to robots while they're still at the lower manufacturing end of the value chain. But there are things, in fact, that humans still do. And what I think is so win-win about investing in sustainable urbanization is that robots don't build cities. There is precisely one robot that is or soon will be capable of contributing to the construction of buildings. It's actually at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology at their lab in Singapore, and it's a 2-story tall robot that literally can sort of do various aspects of building construction, but it's not tall enough to build a building. We, the people, still actually build buildings. The #1 project of the future, and the #1 job creating opportunity of the future, and the #1 political and ecological priority of the future, is to build sustainable cities, and that is where the jobs will also come from. So if you worry about youth unemployment, as you very well should in India or across the Arab world, this is also your answer, right? It is investing in jobs that are involved in building sustainable urban infrastructure. This has been identified by Frost & Sullivan and other research firms as a $3.3 trillion opportunity, particularly social impact, health, education, sustainability, and so forth. These are areas where pension funds and other companies are now, other entities are now looking to invest as well. You know, it takes sort of a village, as they like to say. It's not going to be done by any one government alone. Even in China, this is a space where the innovation is the policy is being dictated by the government. The innovation is coming actually from a lot of companies that are adapting technologies to these. So you have to move away from the idea that you will wait for the government to come up with the answers towards a much more sort of chaotic, if you will, sort of approach. Think of people as infrastructure, right? Everyone is carrying a mobile phone. Everyone has data. We can start to move services to where the people are, and that is going to be a more efficient way to deal with these things. Let me start to move ahead. This is going to require a lot of infrastructure investment. India is not on this chart, unfortunately. The investment to GDP ratio is one of the strongest correlates to long-term sustained economic growth, right? China's is by far the highest in the world. Their growth has also been quite resilient in the face of the financial crisis and other major economic stresses. India's growth has been very volatile. And part of the reason that growth has been volatile in the last 10 years is, of course, because the infrastructure is lacking, so the economic mobility is lacking, so the ability to cope with financial shocks or dips in exports and so forth is also not there. I'm showing you this correlation here. There's only a couple of outliers to this, generally natural resource economies. But you can see that Vietnam, China, Malaysia, the countries that have committed about 10% of their annual budgets to infrastructure outlays have had stable growth. Countries that have underinvested in infrastructure, like Nigeria, like Indonesia, like India, have had lower growth over time. The differential in growth in India is, of course, not just because of infrastructure, it's also politics. And devolution is a major theme in India today, and it's likely to continue to be that way. Those states that have sort of, at the provincial level, or at least the sub-federal level, taken the reins of the opportunities to build infrastructure and attract investment have obviously performed the best. This brings me back actually to Mumbai, in the sense that one has to raise the question, the level of authority, where cities have the municipal authority to act almost like countries and to direct their own policies and generate their own investments, have their own municipal bond markets and so forth, they're able to invest much more rapidly in infrastructure. Mumbai, of course, is not a state unto itself. Right? There is a lot of political competition for the ownership of the resources, the capital, the rents, the taxes of this city. Not only at the federal level, of course, because this city contributes a large share of that. Then at the state level of Maharashtra, then there's the city, what's left for the city. Around the world, I am seeing cities, mayors, that are seizing political authority so that they can find ways to harness the capital generated in their city to make those internal infrastructural investments that make their city better. I used to travel around to meet defense ministers and other sorts of people. Now I just try to meet mayors and deputy mayors. Or in particular, the office that I'm most interested in is the head of international affairs in the office of the mayor. That's the person I always want to meet these days when I travel. More and more cities have that person. That is the person who is going out and attracting investment directly to that city because they're sick of waiting for the federal capital to do it for them. Because then they'll just get pennies from whatever dollar comes in. I've said this enough, and again, hats off to Mumbai First to being an all-inclusive public-private kind of effort. Wherever I'm seeing successful examples of real change in the quality of infrastructure and in the citizen-focused, citizen-centric approaches to infrastructure, it's because there is a strong involvement of the academic community, of civil society, as well as governments and companies. I've mentioned before, and again, Narendra gave a good example of bringing in the head of security from London after the Mumbai terrorist attacks. this is happening in all sorts of areas. Cities are learning from each other, they're cooperating with each other, they're building their own inter-city diplomatic networks. I first became interested in the cities issue precisely because I was looking at diplomatic networks, and I realized that cities were starting to conduct their own diplomacy with each other, transcending the role of the federal government. If ever there were a city that needs to conduct its own diplomacy, to bring in best practices, to build its own sort of model, it is Mumbai. Right? Because you know that the answer is not going to come from New Delhi and that the action is not going to come from New Delhi. So I strongly advocate following in the footsteps of the Londons, the New Yorks, the Dubais, the Frankfurts, and other cities around the world that I'm seeing that are learning the best practices on sustainability, on security, immigration, and so forth. There is a push now by Mayor Boris Johnson of London to issue a London-only visa. He wants to make sure that there is no talent gap in any industry in London. So he's saying, let's create a visa. I don't know if he's going to put sort of, RFID tags on the ankles of the Indian and Chinese talented professionals who he's going to bring in. But immigration is a very sensitive federal issue. And here is a city that's saying, a mayor who has the audacity, the boldness, and quite frankly, he's brilliant, to say, do not want any talent shortages in my city. I have a world financial capital. I don't care what Great Britain's immigration policy is. I don't care if the farmers are opposed to Polish people taking their jobs. My city will have a full employment in the key growth driving sectors. And that's what it takes. So, absolute final point is just to summarize these opportunities. You have urbanization, infrastructure investment, technology, new kinds of governance. It's all coming together, not in countries, but in cities, which is why I confidently believe that the 21st century is not really about great power rivalries. It's really about mastering and bringing about sustainable urbanization. I hope that India is going to get on that bandwagon. Thank you very much. I know I've gone on too long, but if there's time, there has to be some time, I hope, for some discussion. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. The question was about critical infrastructure protection and security. Absolutely. I mean, this is an issue. I think because we're dealing with cyberspace, the physical geography of the city cannot be, sort of precisely pinned down. But of course, that threat to cities is every bit as real as the physical terrorist threat. The critical infrastructure is largely in cities, or it's also the natural resources, the water, the food, the supply chains that come into cities. So again, we're seeing a substantial part of the effort go into that area. So I don't single it out as a different category. I mean, I brought it up there quite a few times, but I didn't really flesh it out. But yes, that is to the extent that there is significant investment going on right now. In the technology aspect, generally security is in the lead. So, for example, you have cities like Beijing and London and New York, where there are cameras just about everywhere at this point. There's almost nothing that is not. So the Boston bombers, for example, were rapidly identified, because of all of the cameras around the city of Boston. So yes, that's there. And I also, quite frankly, didn't go deeply enough into the downside of that. Right, all of the issues around privacy, protection of civil liberties, and so forth. Cities are going to be the places where we not only experiment with the technology, but where we have the political fallout first and foremost as well, which is why there's a separate body of work that people are doing around what's called the Urban Bill of Rights, which is kind of different from a more traditional federal constitutional Bill of Rights, because life in a city is going to be different technologically, fundamentally, from other places, and therefore there needs to be something of an Urban Bill of Rights where you opt in and opt out of certain kinds of ubiquitous technologies that will know more about you because you do live in that city than they would in some other place. It's a very good point.
Roughly, when do you expect the population to cross 9 billion, and how much urbanization would be there at that time? And what do you think is the impact going to be on rural areas of this great urbanization?
So I'm not a demographer, but I was just sort of summarizing for you what I've seen in terms of the recent data and studies. But the world population hitting 9 billion is expected around or before the year 2030. Much of that growth, as I mentioned, coming from the southern hemisphere, from the developing countries, very to a large extent from Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and so forth. Those are very young regions, in fact. So demographically, the youngest parts of the world. The Middle East actually has a youth bulge now, but actually has a very low fertility rate, whereas the areas that have young population and high fertility rate are Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia. So where will according to most of the research that's done on this, at that point in time, of those 9 billion, 70+% would be urbanized. And so they'll be living largely in these mega city, sort of super city types of places like Cairo, Lagos, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Jakarta, Manila, and so forth. And that's generally. And in terms of the hinterlands, I mean, there's a political view and there's an environmental view. The political view is that this is some kind of a liability. If you do a survey, as I've done informally, of people in London, you'll find that most of them want to secede from the rest of the country because their taxes, basically subsidize 50 million people who don't live in the city of London, right? It's not even just their city, it's the 1 square mile of London known as the city, which is, of course, where the financial services are, subsidizes an entire country. Right, so I mean, this is particularly poignant, I think, for Indians, who, having been run by that country for a long time. All that country's economy has been reduced to that 1 square mile. That's it. That's all Great Britain has left going for it. And the rest is considered a liability. But of course, it's the resources. How can the technology that is developed in urban laboratories be sort of deployed to generate, and particularly in agriculture? I mean, agribusiness is absolutely one of the top 2 or 3 most important industries of the 21st century. How do you feed 9 billion people? So taking advantage of what arable land is left in countries that have too rapidly urbanized, or new arable land that's becoming available with climate change in certain areas like Russia and so forth. These are the huge questions. We have to apply technology to these questions because that is ultimately where the resources are going to come from to bring about, to have this urbanization be sustainable, and to avoid resource wars.
I think the problems which cities face are much more basic, like shortage of water, electricity, and so on. So how are those going to be met? How are those problems going to be overcome?
Some of the slides that I went through quickly about smart cities are about the issue of energy efficiency. So the thrust of your question is absolutely correct. Most of our problems are really about these basic kinds of resource provisions like electricity, water, sanitation, and so forth. And a lot of the reason we have those problems is because of cultural and political inefficiency in how we deal with our existing resources. So it's not necessarily about creating entirely new supplies, but about managing what we have, managing the leakage. But there are, so smart grids, which I mentioned only briefly, are one example of this. A smart grid can be used in a rich environment and also in a poor one. You can have a smart grid, like for example, off-grid solar network that can feed power provide power for an entire slum. Right. So rather than the complex process of the theft of electricity from an existing grid, you can actually create off-grid power supplies through alternative energy that are used in slum areas. So you're applying technology to a very poor area. Or in a rich country like Stockholm, in port cities, which generate huge amounts of emissions from ships that are docked off port and that have their power still on while they're in port. What Stockholm has done is they're in the process of developing this whole area called the Royal Seaport, which will be a zero emissions area. So ships turn themselves off, they sort of plug in and generate power from a smart grid power supply that takes excess power from the national grid and provides it there. So you end up having a zero emissions port. So whether it's a rich city or a poor city, I think there are interesting applications of technology. Water is different fundamentally. I mean, the groundwater depletion that happens outside of cities to feed cities affects the cities through some of the examples I gave you. But water supply is going to be a major issue. It's going to be, business for the desalination industry, that's for sure, because what we don't see happening sufficiently is the kind of, again, the cultural efforts to improve efficiency to decrease water consumption. Water consumption per capita in the United States is 5 times higher than it is in Great Britain. And in Great Britain, they're not exactly known as being the most eco-conscious people either. They're not exactly Swiss. So a lot of that problem is cultural as well. You know, the United States is not only looking at its own natural gas supplies through shale and the XL pipeline from Canada, it's going to start importing water from Canada. The most urbanizing region in the United States is the southwest of the United States, like all the retirees who go to Nevada and New Mexico and Arizona and all of these kinds of places. That is the desert. It is rapidly desertifying, and the groundwater is depleting. So a lot of Americans, millions of Americans, are moving to places that have no water. So they're going to start building water canals from Canada all the way down, 3,000 miles, 2,000 miles, to reach the deserts where the people are moving to. So the big infrastructures of the 21st century are going to be built to try to address the question that you're talking about. That's why the river diversion is happening in China already.
The title of your talk today is The Age of Cities, How Can India Adapt? To make it more relevant to Mumbai, you have already identified Mumbai as one of the larger cities, and we have 17 different authorities in control. With your experience, do you have a practical solution to find a way out for Mumbai?
Well, I mean, I would object to the phrasing "find a way out," unless you actually mean leave the city and make life better for everyone else by not driving your car in Mumbai. But yeah. So, I mean, I've given quite a few examples, and which is to say that there is not one solution, right? It's a combination of all of these things. It's the new infrastructure that decongests. It's the bus rapid transit that doesn't exist in this city. It's improving the railways to accommodate more people, encouraging more passengers. It's the upgrading of the sort of the invisible infrastructures, the sewers and the water treatment and all of these kinds of things. It is creating more distributed economic activity. So London, for example, is a collection of towns. Boris Johnson likes to say London is a city of villages, right? Each is not an autonomous economic entity, but you can live and work in the same place. Mixed use, in other words, real estate. So you're seeing this happening in the new urban plans of a city like Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is, geographically speaking, as large or larger than Mumbai. It's just enormous. You can drive for hours, fall asleep, wake up, fall asleep, wake up. You're still in the same neighborhood of Sao Paulo. So they're moving towards a whole new kind of mixed-use set of projects where people will live and work in the same general area and avoid the kind of congestion of the one central place. That is perhaps, you know, because we don't have hours and hours to catalog everything Mumbai needs to do, I would say if there's a silver bullet, this decentralization of economic activity through the development of mixed-use clusters in many different areas to diminish the volume of commuting and increase the efficiency of economic activity in different areas so that there is no completely choked off poor area that has no economic activity. That, I think, is perhaps the single most important thing that I see very, very large-scale cities needing to do and starting to do. Shanghai does this quite well, actually. Mexico City is learning to do this. Sao Paulo is learning to do this. Mumbai most definitely needs to do this. Right. So, not just a mayor, but as I said, you know, you need to have.
No, I was thinking. That will basically happen if you. See, London has a mayor, New York has a mayor who is responsible, and who knows if he doesn't deliver, he will not be re-elected. Right. So there is no single person accountable or responsible for the city. Right. And you have different people looking at their own spheres. They work together, but there's no cohesive policy.
But let's always distinguish between personalities and institutions. Even if Boris Johnson were not the mayor of London, charismatic and aggressive as he is, there is a vested authority in the office of the mayor that allows anyone to do that. So what Mumbai needs is not just a good mayor, because if that mayor doesn't have constitutional authorities, then it's wobbly ground. It needs to be a state. Actually, that's the only way. And I know that's a revolutionary statement, but this is, if there's one fact of life around the world when it comes to how authority needs to be distributed so that your heroic mayor can actually achieve what they need to. It's to, well, if you can create a 28th state, as has been done in the last month or two. What is Telangana, 28th or 29th?
I have a
Right,
question.
so you can have one more in India.
We'll take one more question. Sabina, yes.
Yeah, I found the statement, when you said sustainable cities and then you said built cities you gave examples of built cities, I found it to be a bit of a paradox because traditionally cities have been, the spaces have come up because of communities who have moved there. Whereas here, this is a really top-down approach where you build a space and then you tell people go live there and make it a city. The example you gave, Lavasa, I mean, if you actually go there and you see the servant quarters that they have, it's a two-tier city because the servant quarters are like a slum ghetto, vertical slum ghetto, And the other example that you gave in Abu Dhabi, if you calculate the food miles, because they need to import all of their food, that's way more unsustainable than all of the houses that they built with the solar panels. Yeah. So isn't it so paradoxical?
No, I think you're making a great point. Well, there's a reason why I put the Lavasa example right next to the Lagos example, right? I mean, there's a lot of flaws in the way some of these projects have been designed, and you've absolutely hit it on the head. I didn't even talk about Masdar, but I could sort of go on forever about the flaws of Masdar, but you found a couple of the biggest ones right there. They should absolutely be making provisions for growing food in these places, and they're not doing that. There are efforts to, such as in Japan, for example, they're experimenting with vertical farms in some of their urban redevelopment projects a lot more. Singapore is going to, I didn't talk about Singapore the whole night, although it's kind of the smartest city in many of these areas. They're going to be doing a lot more vertical farming in Singapore as well, even as they industrialize. So this notion that whatever you build, you add a way of contributing back to the environment, whether it's a tree planting or something like that. That should be part of the equation. It shouldn't just be a technocratic, top-down, scientific kind of exercise. And so I was not trying to imply that is the right answer. But new city construction as a way of absorbing the urbanizing masses and hopefully building those cities in a way that is itself sustainable, that is what I'm advocating. I'm not saying that it's being done well on a large scale. If it were, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Parag. Let's give him a warm round of appreciation.
Thank you.
And the BSc would like to express their gratitude, and so Ram and Ashish, we'd like to do the honors so that Parag takes a little bit of BSc with him to Singapore. One group picture. Narendra, please come. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Parag. Thank you, Ram, Ashish, BSc, and each and every one of you for this lovely, thought-provoking evening. Thank you so much.